we've seen them use executive authority, the Obama administration use executive authority in ways that seems to benefit their political calculations, right? With immigration, with the sort of backdoor DREAM Act saying we're not going to deport certain people just because we don't want to. Well, prosecutorial discretion from law enforcement agencies also seems to lend itself to that. You can actually say, hey, let's take a look at that guy. Didn't Bill Clinton, by the way, do this with some of his opponents with the IRS and auditing?
There were certainly
do you guys see this?
Of that.
There were certainly accusations of it.
And I think, you know, well, in journalism they say 3 is a trend. So perhaps you've identified a trend here. The first with Mr. Adelson seems to be partisan in nature in terms of the November election. The Gibson guitar, maybe that's more ideological. You mentioned the environmentalists, and then the IRS. Well, that's the IRS, which is pretty scary no matter how you slice it.
It's an executive agency.
Sure, it's an executive agency. What I'm concerned with is that it seems that the harassment might be being ratcheted up. The White House was reported already to be targeting big donors to Romney's campaign and trying to smear their reputations in terms of how they earn that money. Now you have the Department of Justice, which can go a lot further. It can take away your liberty. It can take away your property. When you involve the government and law enforcement, we're talking about sitting there in court and having to defend yourself legally, not just, you know, on MSNBC.
Come on, libertarians. You guys.
I got a question.
Andrew, I got new outreach from you. I'm waiting for some libertarian rants over here.
The real issue is that we have a behemoth government, and when you have lots of vague laws that are enforced selectively and arbitrarily, then we just open ourselves up to these kinds of problems. It's not like one party is more likely to use this than the other. It just means that when government has these tools, they
so
might
do you
be
think
using
these are just
them.
bureaucrats run amok and not an actual campaign by a White House trying to get reelected?
Well, I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to theorize on this, but I am saying that when government has, when it selectively and arbitrarily enforces all these vague laws that are on the books, it gives them the power to do that, which they might be doing.
Do we really believe, Andrew, that 5-year-old money laundering charges against this guy's company are coming up to the surface right now, and that's just the way it went? It's not like these charges expire on November 6th.
Is Adelson's casinos union? Are they union?
I would have
because there's a fight now between the UFC and the restaurant workers here in New York because Dana White's business partners run a non-union casino. Gibson is also non-union. We've seen, we saw the story today that Delphi, through Geithner, was willing to cancel the pension deals for the non-union workers as part of the UAW GM bailout. So I'm having to wonder, is this bigger than ideological and bigger than the money, because it seems like there's other forces at work here.
Well, I mean, we just had the DCCC having to apologize to Mr. Adelson.
Because he threatened to sue them.
Abject apology.
He can sue them a lot.
Abject apology for trying to suggest that he made his money through the China.
They called him a pimp, I believe was the word
right.
they used. Yeah.
So clearly, that's not the first time that he's been, you know, in their sights, if I'm allowed to use that metaphor anymore. My question is, politically, isn't this kind of stupid to rattle a hornet's nest of a billionaire hornet?
I think it has a big chilling effect. I think the people who are thinking about getting more involved, who are thinking about throwing full-throated support behind the Republican presidential contender here with Mitt Romney, look at this and they say, I don't want this problem. If they can go after Sheldon Adelson and make problems for him, if they're willing to even as you say, stir up that hornet's nest, if you're some guy who's in a community who has enough money to maybe make a difference there, maybe in a key swing state, you might say, I don't need
Who's the senator from Nevada?
But there's a distinction.
Mr. Reed is
There's a distinction there, though, between the kind of blowback that you get as a millionaire or a billionaire who wants to put his money where his mouth is. You can understand that within the public square there's all sorts of reactions, and I think that those are legitimate. It's free speech rights, it's people who are upset with the way that they see this money being spent. But there's a difference between that and crossing the line into using the powers of government to further your aims in a way that is completely vicious and is only going to have further blowback in the future. And you saw that, you know, under the Nixon administration and under previous administrations. This doesn't work in the long term because eventually your party is going to lose power, and then those tools still remain there to be used against you.
And Leonardo DiCaprio might depict you in a movie.
I have to agree with Andrew, though. I think he brought up a good point about special interests, because if you look into the Gibson case, it's actually not about endangered species or even endangered trees. It's actually about protectionism. I mean, this comes down to the Lacey Act, and you want to know who's in favor of this act and the provisions that have, the amendments that have been made to it over time are, you know, American companies that don't want competition from other companies. It's essentially some companies are benefited by the Lacey Act at the expense of all the other companies, because essentially what's going on is that the problem with the wood with the Gibson guitars was not that they imported it from India or illegally, but what they were doing is that it was not the correct level of thickness and it wasn't finished.
In India, it has to be finished in India.
It has to be finished in India. This is a labor law. It's protectionism and it's labor
not our
laws.
labor law. We're now subject
Right.
to the labor
But
laws of other
companies
countries.
in our country like that law because it gives them a competitive advantage.
it gives them the ability to hire the money.
Special interests make a big difference here.
And National Fish and Wildlife prosecuted or was involved in that investigation, as were other sort of federal regulators. And it seemed to me like they were trying to make a pretty big example of Gibson in this case. They certainly saw through. There was a lot of outrage from people across the political spectrum, I think, about how it went down in the early stages, and they still kept it going forward. They're now paying a fine to avoid, by the way, criminal, not civil liability.
They'll never do that again.
For this thickness of wood issue you're talking about,
to
they
jail?
actually were facing possible jail time, which also goes to show us the kind of sort of tyrannical enforcement issues.
It would have been a lot more interesting if they had actually found grizzly bears inside as opposed to just non-thickened enough wood.